Denise, whenever you're ready, we're ready to begin.
Okay. All right. Listen, first of all, I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, Matthew, for inviting me to share a little bit about what it was like to be there on the ground, experiencing these things. As I said earlier before we started, Oprah and I had actually experienced this a few times in the past. It's actually gotten to be a joke in our family that whenever we're planning a trip, we have to give them a warning so they can get out of town, because literally every time we've been in Israel, something has happened. Starting with when I met my husband. I met him during Shalom Galil in 1982, right on up to 2014 when we were in Tel Aviv, when missiles were fired in Tel Aviv. Back then, we were there with my mom. So for my husband, my mom, and I, this wasn't the first time, but for my children, Danielle and Ariel, and when I say children, they're always going to be my babies. My daughter Danielle is a 33-year-old criminal defense attorney in Los Angeles. My baby is a 29-year-old who is a marketing executive in New York. And I think in the way of context, I want to explain first why we went, because a lot of people said, well, we're in the middle of a pandemic. What are you doing in Israel? And, you know, basically, we're all Israeli citizens. My husband clearly, so am I because of my mom. My mom's a citizen and my children have citizenship because of my husband. So we all have Israeli passports. And even though foreign nationals weren't allowed to go into Israel yet, we were allowed, provided we went through some hoops. And we made the decision to do it for the following reason. We hadn't seen anybody in the family, like everybody else here, for a year and a half. My daughter in LA, I hadn't seen since November 2019. My mom lost 2 siblings during the course of the pandemic and really, really wanted to see her last surviving sibling, her sister, who lives in Israel, as does most of her family. And then finally, my husband hadn't seen his mom, and she also lives in Israel with his family. So rather than trying to figure out who to visit first, we decided to just fly everybody to Israel and have a family reunion there, which we did on May 3rd. And I'm going to share the screen. We had a family reunion literally in the parking lot of Ben Gurion Airport is when we all finally got together after a year and a half of not seeing each other. Now, we also did have to go through some hoops in order to get in Israel what's called the Green Pass. Now, I know a lot's transpired since then, but then we were still in a pandemic at the tail end. And in Israel, they were way ahead of everybody else on vaccination. So we had to have a PCR 72 hours before we left here, another PCR test as soon as we landed in the airport, and then we had to have an antibody test. Once we went through all of those hoops, we filed all that documentation with Israel's Ministry of Health, and we were issued what's called a Green Pass, which gave us access to restaurants and shopping malls and so on. So I'm just going to share something a little humorous with you, which could only happen in Israel if you understand the Israeli mentality. My husband arranged for us to have the antibody test literally in the parking lot of Ben Gurion Airport. So if you could just imagine, this nurse shows up with an ice bucket, with syringes, with gloves and the whole thing. And we're all sitting on this bench, and one after the other, he goes down and he's taking our blood work right off of the parking garage. So I'm going to share screen and start sharing some of these pictures so that you get a feel for this. Let's see. All right, let me see if I can make this work. Is that shared? No, not yet. Why is this not working? It says only one participant can share at a time. Am I able to share? Okay.
You have to get permission from the host to share.
Yeah, I know, and I should have it. I don't know why it's not working.
You are a co-host. Oh, it's working now.
There we go. All right, beautiful. I love when it comes together. Okay, so yeah, I call this our post-pandemic vacation. Kind of like in the old days, we used to say, what I did on my summer vacation. Well, this was our post-pandemic vacation. And here's a picture of us all showing off our recently, stuck arms. We literally are right here. I don't know if you can see, but right here, that's the parking garage of Ben Gurion Airport. And here we are, we all just got our blood tested. Here on the right side, this is the Green Pass. A lot of people were curious as to what that looked like. Once you got everything to the Israeli Ministry of Health, they texted this to you, you put it on your phone, and then you had access. And so for the first week, we had a fabulous family vacation. We were out and about. Israel was open for business. We were doing restaurants and visiting family. We're having the time of our life. It was a fabulous first week. Right around Friday, when we were doing Shabbat dinner, things of the rioting was starting in Jerusalem. And honestly, we didn't think that much about it because it was the end of Ramadan. And that's pretty typical. On a Friday, you'll have a day of rage, and there might be some rioting or protests in Jerusalem. And it wasn't that unusual. So it was kind of this noise in the background, and we were still, doing our thing. We celebrated Mother's Day that Sunday, and everything was lovely. We had a wonderful breakfast in one of our favorite restaurants in Hod Hashem. Highly recommend it. And by Tuesday, there was already more and more protests developing in what we call the mixed towns. When I say mixed, I mean Muslim population, Christian population, and Jewish population. And that's why we also had dinner in a neighborhood called Ajami. Some of you are on the mission, the Federation mission with us, and we're on our bus and met my mom, and may remember that she grew up in Ajami. And that's a mixed neighborhood in the Jaffa area. We were supposed to go to a restaurant there. And because of the beginning of the unrest, we decided Italian restaurant. Ironically enough, there's some backstory to that, but not for now. And right in between getting the appetizers and the main course, we had our first red alert. A couple of things when I show this to you, I want you to pay attention to. The shelter is not just for the one restaurant, it's pretty much for the whole block. So you're going to see after we get through the kitchen, all of a sudden everybody converges and you see a real bottleneck of people. At that point, we're absolutely outdoors and exposed. And then just as we turn the corner, right before we get into the bomb shelter, you're going to hear people saying something in Hebrew. What they're saying is, I can hear the explosions, I can hear the explosions. We were not yet in the bomb shelter when that happened. So I just want to put this for you. That's my mom.
It's okay, don't just leave your pocketbook. It's okay, Taka. Let's go. Let's go. We're going to the mikvah, okay?
Mikvah means bomb shelter.
It's okay. You don't need your pocketbook, Taka. It's okay. Okay? We're just going to go on the mikvah, okay? תודה רבה.
בואי ניכנס לבשל עכשיו.
כן, עכשיו נבשל קצת. הכל בסדר, הכל בסדר. אוקיי.
Sorry. Whoops. I wanted to just give you a sense of what that felt like and how long that took. That video lasts 2 minutes. In Tel Aviv, you have 90 seconds. So we overshot it by at the very I could hear the firing. I could hear the firing. We heard the Iron Dome take off. You can hear it go whoosh, and then you can hear the explosions over your head. That didn't come through on the video, but people were commenting about it on the video. What I want to share is we're lucky because we had 90 seconds. People that live in the Gaza envelope or all the border towns around Gaza have anywhere from 5 to 15 seconds to do what we just did in 90, or actually in 2 minutes. So for any mother or any parent who has more than one child in the home, every time the siren rings, it's a Sophie's choice. They have to literally sit and decide, which kid am I going to grab? Am I going to go into the bedroom to get the one that's studying, or am I going to run out to the backyard and get the one that's playing out in the backyard? It's a horrible, horrible choice. There was a video that went viral during this time in Israel. He's got 10 to 15 seconds. He's 6 years old. He doesn't race to the shelter himself. He goes over to the couch, picks up his 2-year-old infant sister and carries her to the bomb shelter. So for me, watching this as a parent, it was gut-wrenching to think for a minute that this is something that a parent has to teach a 6-year-old child to do. But that's the reality. That's the life and death reality that Israelis face. Another thing I want to point out about this is, as I was saying before a lot of people logged on, my mom was steady as a rock. We all were freaking out, and she was as calm as could be. And I want to share that this was only one video. We did this 4 times. Every time we got back, you have to wait at least 10, 15 minutes after the alarm is over, because a lot of people don't realize they see little poops of smoke in the air and you think, oh, the missiles aren't evaporated. Once it's taken out by Iron Dome, it's shattered, and all of the splinters, all of the metal continues to rain to the ground for another 10 to 15 minutes. So even though the alarm may be over, you have to.
Denise, you're still sharing your screen. You can unshare your screen.
I'd rather just keep it because I'm going to go on to a couple of other slides.
Okay.
And I don't want to, play around with finding it again. Now that I have it, I'm going to keep it. But anyway, so the stuff has to fall to the ground before you can actually go back out. So we went into the shelter and back out, sat down, alarm went off again, and we did that 4 times. After they brought us our food, nobody wanted to eat. So we basically said to the staff, why don't you keep it, take it home, enjoy it yourselves. We weren't hungry. My mother, even though the rest of us were all shaken up, she was, which is why I wanted to share this picture. Back to the hotel. This is the real Instagram post. This is my mom holding on to my daughter and her basically saying, bragging about what a badass her grandma is for being so steady during all of this. This is a picture of the bomb shelter we had in the hotel. We had to run to it a couple of times that night and again the following night. We slept with the windows open because inside the hotel you couldn't hear the sirens, so we left the windows open so we could hear it from the outside. And it kind of worked out that Ofer and I were on the 6th floor, my kids and my mom were on the 7th floor. We didn't want to separate. So every time an alarm went off, I had 90 seconds to race up the stairs, knock on the door and wake up my kids, knock on the door, wake up my mom, convene them in the hallway, and then race to the bomb shelter on the 7th floor. I'll skip it now. Once this all started, since my kids had never...
we know.
I'm sorry? Hello? Oh, okay. So these are the instructions that one of my cousin's daughters sent my children. And it basically doing a scenario and what you're supposed to do with each one. The reason I'm showing this to you, I'll translate. The relevant one is number 3. And my cousin's daughter sent this to my kid the next morning. And I'll tell you why it's relevant in a minute. Number 3 is, what do you do when a siren goes off and you're in your car? And contrary to a lot of the news reports, we were watching foreign film crews hiding under their car. That's not what you're supposed to do. If it goes off and it hits your car will explode. So the recommendation is you have to leave your car and try to get to a safe area. Now, if you can find a building or a home where the door is open, that's great. But if you can't, then they tell you to get as far away from the vehicle. The reverberations will shatter the glass and splinter everywhere. So they tell you to get far away from any vehicle, hit the ground, face down, cover your head. Those are the instructions. Another thing I'll share is in Israel, during a time like this, when alarms go off, people leave their front doors open. Imagine this for a minute. If I'm driving down the street and there's a home nearby, chances are if I go to their house, that door will be open and I'm invited to come in and sit in the shelter with them. I don't know any other country where that would happen, but that's the degree to which Israel is one family dealing with this together. So the next day, my kids actually had to exercise option number 3. They went with my cousins, and they got they were caught with a red alert, and they were shown. This is I'm going to learn my daughter's voice. This one was her Instagram post on what happened. I was on the road with my cousin and sister. We pulled over and ran from the car in case there was a direct hit and the car exploded. I covered my sister. She cried and shook. We heard the bombs blow up overhead. I saw them. We got back in the car and booked it to my uncle's house where he has a shelter. A family with a daughter stopped behind us, and the mother covered her crying daughter. If you aren't here, please refrain from making judgments about the people who live here. That was her Instagram post. And then next to it, this is actually my daughter Ariel, the younger one, who my older daughter jumped on top of and covered her with her body to protect her. Because my older daughter has always been protecting my younger daughter. That was an experience that really shook them up very, very much. And this continued for several more days. And then my younger one, Ariel, was scheduled to leave Saturday night. And so at this point, I had taken ill. So my husband and my report. And on the next screen, what I'm going to share is what's on the right. Let me shrink this. Okay, what's on the right here is the report or a bulletin from the Home Front Command in Hebrew. But basically what it says is the spokesperson for the military wing of Hamas, Abu Ovadia, was quoted as saying that we're going to start to bomb Tel Aviv between the hours of 10 and midnight. Now, this happened at 9:52. 9 o'clock, I dropped Ariel off at the airport. So I sent it to them, and they proceeded to drive home. As my daughter said, she never saw my husband fly in a car. But they made it back to the hotel in 25 minutes when it's a 40-minute drive. But here we now know my daughter Ariel is basically about to board an airplane. And I juxtapose these two images against each other because this is pretty much a very mundane conversation the two sisters around just before midnight. And basically the last thing that she said, that Danielle said to her before the red alert was, can you watch TV yet? You know, and she's basically saying we've got another 20 minutes. They've got to check out the airplane. Now, I want everybody to imagine for a minute, when you land and you have to disembark from an aircraft, the impatience everybody has, how long does it take to get everybody off of a plane? And when it goes off and you're sitting on a plane on the tarmac, and now you know you have 90 seconds not only to get off a plane, but race down the corridors of Ben Gurion Airport and get into a shelter. And that's the experience that my daughter had. I'll share that one with you. Okay, that's my show and tell. You know, I just wanted to give you a flavor of how we went from having a really, really fun family reunion to it devolving into a lot of stress and a lot of tension. Now, a couple of points I want to make. We were only there for a few days. I mean, we only dealt with it for a week, basically, but Israelis deal with this on and off, and people that live in the South deal with it almost all the time. We were also very lucky. We had 90 seconds. Down in the South, they have 10 to 15 seconds. From our perspective, sitting in Israel, the biggest frustration was watching how this was portrayed in the media and the misinformation that was getting out there and the degree to which it was a very one-sided narrative and a lot of lies. And, you know, my children started to Instagram furiously to try to counter that information. The things that you did not hear on the media were the unbelievable steps that Israel went through in order to protect the innocent Palestinians. What we're hearing in the media are blood libels, basically accusing Israel of deliberately killing Palestinian babies, That's a blood libel. That is not what they do. I can tell you Israelis are heartbroken at any death on either side, whether it's Israeli or it's Palestinian innocent civilians. If it's Hamas, it's something else. Israel is not at war with the Palestinian people. Israel is at war with Hamas, and Hamas is holding the Palestinian people hostage and using them as human shields. It's very difficult to combat an enemy who hides behind innocent people. And yet, if you look at the amount of buildings that were damaged and the number of people that were killed really is quite small compared to the devastation to the infrastructure. But when you have an enemy that takes their infrastructure and hides it behind civilians, there are going to be civilian casualties. It's war and it's tragic. Some of the steps that Israel takes, Israel has the technology to identify every cell phone in any particular area in Israel and in Gaza. So if they've targeted something that's civilian because there's a military target behind it, they call every cell phone in that area and give them a message or a pre-taped message saying this area has been targeted. You have 3 hours to evacuate. Then they send a text message to every cell phone in the area. And then the third thing they do is something that they call knocking on the door, knocking on the roof, which is they will send a dud missile that does absolutely no damage but shakes the building. And then people would then know that they have 15 minutes to finish evacuating. I know that there was a lot of press about the press building that ultimately was taken down, the one that housed Al Jazeera and AP. It also housed the Hamas intelligence headquarters. And the Israeli government ultimately gave enough information to the Biden administration to assure them that that was in fact a military target. And even after Israel did all those three things to evacuate the building, the owner of the building contacted the Israeli government and said, I need more time. And the IDF gave them more time to make sure every civilian could get out of that building before it came down. Interestingly, there were no reports of any civilian casualties when that building was taken down. There's a reason. And I don't know any other army that goes through those lengths to make sure that innocent people are cleared from the area before anything is taken out. A lot of people have asked me also if I was afraid. I want to share that there was not one moment where I was actually afraid for my safety. It felt surreal. It was very stressful. I was more worried about my mother and more worried about my children than it was for anybody's safety. And the reason for that is simple. This is the only place in the world where we have a Jewish army that is going to be there to protect me as a Jew. And I have faith in them, and I have faith in the Iron Dome. So at every single time I've been in Israel, almost, there's been a war, and I've never felt unsafe. I felt stressed. I felt frightened for the IDF, but for my own personal safety, I always felt very secure in knowing that this is a Jewish army that's protecting me as a Jew. And I want to really emphasize to everybody on this call that Israel is the only place where the Jewish people as a people can chart their own future. We've been able to manage our own history and we're charting our own destiny. And for that reason, as a Jewish people that live here in the diaspora, our future is tied together. I think that's become punctuated by the amount of anti-Semitism that came about as a result of this. Whatever Israel does impact ultimately how we have to behave here. We have an obligation, I think, to debunk the misinformation because ultimately our future and Israel's future is together. We are the Jewish people. And I'm going to now turn it over to, are you here? Let me see.
I'm here.
Yeah, hi. Okay, Hugo. I didn't see. Oh, there you go. That's good. We're back to back now. Yeah, I want to turn it over to Hugo.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Denise. Hello, everybody. So this was a very emotional, riveting eyewitness account. And I want to start my comments by reminding you that one of the main consequences of the Hamas actions is to terrorize the population of Israel. Even though when you quantify the number of victims on the Israeli side thanks to a number of reasons, thanks to the efficiency of the Iron Dome defense system, and thanks to the insistence of over the decades of the Israeli government for building codes, to have shelters and to have safe rooms in every new building. Thanks to that, thank God, more people were not hurt, but there was a tremendous number of rockets, more than ever, that were thrown at the major Israeli cities, and the population of half of the country or 2/3 of the country were really terrorized, having less than a minute in most cases to shelter. Okay, now I want to share my screen and go over a little bit of the history and who are the key players, so that we can understand a little better what has happened before this round of fighting between Israel and Hamas, what has happened before, what has happened now. So I'm going to share my screen to my PowerPoint presentation. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Hugo Hurwitz. I'm a member of Beth Torah for many years. I was born in Argentina, but I lived and studied in Israel at the Hebrew University, and I've been a professor of international business and international studies for many years. Let's start with some geography, reminding you where Gaza is and where the West Bank is. All right, so this is Gaza and this is Tel Aviv. Gaza is very, very near the main Israeli cities. It's very near Ashkelon and Ashdod, that were seriously hurt in this round of conflict. And there were also rockets thrown at Jerusalem, and many rockets thrown at Tel Aviv, many at Beersheba. We are going to discuss for a minute the difference between the rulers of Gaza and the rulers of the West Bank. Okay, let's see, let's go back. Yeah. Okay, one more map showing where Gaza is, where the West Bank is, some of the Israeli cities. On this map, you see 3 Israeli cities that I will talk about a little later on. These are mixed Jewish Arab cities, Ramla, Lud, and Acre, in Hebrew, Akko, that unfortunately were the site of a new phenomenon in Israel, which is attacks between Jews and Arabs. I will have more to say about that in a minute. Okay, this is a reminder of where Israel fits in the whole Middle East. I will briefly remind you of what the main countries, whether or not the main countries had an involvement in this conflict. By and large, they haven't. The green one is Saudi Arabia. This is the United Arab Emirates. And these are countries that are on a path of normalizing their relationship with Israel. They felt uncomfortable about the eruption of the conflict with Palestine. They were uncomfortable with the eruption of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, but they haven't said much or done much. Egypt was an intermediary of the ceasefire. Iran was an active supporter of Hamas in arming Hamas and providing the technology for the missiles and the know-how, but it didn't have a direct involvement in the conflict. Okay, Palestinian politics. So we have the Palestinian Authority ruling the West Bank, and that is controlled by Fatah. Fatah is the same organization that is the PLO, the Yasser Arafat organization. The president of Fatah has been Mahmoud Abbas since 2005. He's old, he's sick, he's losing credibility. But on the other hand, the the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, which is another way to refer to the West Bank, has engaged over the last 2-3 decades into a peace process with Israel, a peace process which is not going anywhere lately, but at least the Palestinian Authority has had a moderate reaction to the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Now, the rulers of Gaza are Hamas. The political leader is called Yahya Sinwar. I have a summary of main characteristics. So the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, is referred to as a Palestinian Authority, ruled by Fatah, which is a secular organization, not a religious Muslim organization. On the other hand, Hamas is an extremist Islamist organization devoted to the destruction of Israel, explicitly so, uninterested in a peace process. Some comparisons between the West Bank and Gaza. Which one is controlled by Israel? Gaza is not controlled by Israel. In 2005, Israel withdrew from Gaza, and since 2006, Hamas has been controlling Gaza. You would think that Hamas had 16 years to run Gaza and to try to improve the economic conditions of its population, to improve the standard of living, but Hamas has devoted its energy and resources to to military purposes against Israel. There are no settlements in Gaza. So the people in Gaza cannot complain of Israeli army patrols running in the streets, or roadblocks, or settlements, because Israel withdrew from Gaza more than 15 years ago. Hamas is not interested in the peace process. Hamas has decided to choose violence as a way to confront Israel, and that's the difference with the West Bank and Fatah. Economic prosperity. There has been substantial economic prosperity in the West Bank as a result of a significant degree of cooperation with Israel. Gaza, on the other hand, is subject to two problems. One is that the lack of priority that the Hamas government has given to the improvement of conditions of the population, but also there is an economic blockade that Israel is imposing since Hamas came to power, which is part of the dialogue now, whether that's a good idea or not. There is no doubt that the people in Gaza are living in very difficult conditions, and they also have very few political freedoms. There haven't been elections neither in Gaza nor on the West Bank in many years. And regarding popularity, in the West Bank, the popularity of Fatah is going down. And in Gaza, Hamas is not particularly popular. Perhaps now, with every military confrontation, they become a little more popular for daring to confront Israel. There have been, this is the fourth round of fighting since 2008. There was an Israel-Hamas round of fighting that lasted 22 days in 2008, and then again in 2012, a major one in 2014, which was the last one 7 years ago, and this one, which in duration is considered to be short and moderate. There was no ground incursion. But this begs the question of why, what's happening here? Are we caught in a vicious cycle of a major war between Israel and Hamas every few years? And I will have more to say about that in a minute. Now, what happened on this round? Okay, there were a number of factors that increased the tensions in the days leading to the eruption of the war. During the month of Ramadan, the Jerusalem police imposed certain restrictions. It sounds like trivial and superficial issues. In one of the entrance to the old city of Jerusalem, in the place where Arab youth used to congregate and sit near the gate where people are coming in and out, that has been the situation every year, but this year the Jerusalem police decided that they will change the arrangements and forbid that configuration. It sounds like a technical, not very important matter, but it was the sort of a lot of complaints and criticism. Now, there was a very hot dispute and protest in the neighborhood of Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah. It has to do with a property dispute regarding a number of Arab families that lived on property that had been Jewish owned before 1948, but then that area was under Jordanian control between 48 and 67, and then after the 6 Days War, when all of Jerusalem came back to be in Israeli hands, there was a judicial process started regarding who should own that property, who has the right to live there. There were a number of Supreme Court rulings, and to make a long story short, it's a property dispute, but the far-right parties in Israel were interested in speeding up the eviction of the families. And there were a lot, it's a very sensitive issue regarding the eviction of Arab families from their houses. And it was heating the environment. Okay, in addition to that, as part of the protest, the Israeli police entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is located on the Temple Mount, and used tear gas. Now, the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa Mosque is a very, very, very sensitive issue for Arabs and for the whole Muslim world. Many times in the past, there were accusations that Israel wants to change the status quo of who has access to the Muslim sites in Jerusalem, and that was the cause or the excuse for an outcry of everybody in the Arab world, everybody in the Muslim world. Now, it was not, from my perspective, was not a great idea for the Israeli police to enter the Al-Aqsa Mosque and use tear gas, and that was part of the issues that precipitated the actions of Hamas. So what happened now? This is important. What happened now is that Hamas decided to take advantage of the opportunity and take an visible, active action to endorse the protesters and, quote, defend Jerusalem. So Hamas issued an ultimatum saying that all Israeli security forces had to be removed from the Temple Mount and from the disputed neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah by 6 p.m. or else they would attack. Now, that's pretty explicit. The question is, do you take that seriously or not? The commentary is that Israeli authorities did not take that ultimatum seriously. And that ultimatum was actually very, very serious because they had every intention to attack, and they did attack with ferocious, please mute your microphones, with ferocious rounds of rockets. So, so there were salvos of dozens of rockets at the time launched by Hamas on major Israeli cities like Ashkelon, like Ashdod, like Beersheba, and Tel Aviv. There were some lobbed at Jerusalem, but not too many, but lots of, more than in the past, lots of rockets and missiles launched at Israeli cities, prompting the usual the usual Iron Dome response and people running to the shelters all the time. Now remember that in Tel Aviv, you have 90 seconds to run to the shelters, but in the cities in the south, closer to Gaza, like Ashdod, like Ashkelon, like Sderot, you have like 20 seconds, 15 seconds. It's ridiculous. It's very, very scary. It's very terrorizing. Now, a new problem developed in this round of the conflict, which is a wave of violence between Jews and Arabs in mixed towns like Lod or Acre or Haifa. Now, a lot has been said about this shocking development because these are towns that there was decent coexistence between Jews and Arabs for many years. Now, so basically this is the result of extremists on both sides. On the Arab side, in recent days, the investigations in terms of who was involved, there was a lot of youth, marginalized youth, many of them with criminal involvement or involved with criminal gangs. On the Jewish side, there were many of the people involved in violence against Arabs were not residents of the towns, but were people that came from elsewhere, in most cases, either settlers or ultra right-wing extremists that decided to engage in violence against any Arabs. Just like extremist Arabs decided to engage in violence against any Jews, which is a terrible, terrible development. Fortunately, there are great efforts on behalf of the Jews and the Arabs, the mainstream of the communities, to pacify the situation and to be very vociferous about the fact that they are not going to let the extremists ruin those relationships. Now, Israel attacked Gaza in retaliation for the rockets with the following objectives: to destroy the rocket launchers, to try to destroy as much as possible of the military and intelligence headquarters, to try to destroy or damage the very, very elaborate network of tunnels in the Gaza Strip, and whenever possible to go after military and political leaders. I'm running out of time. I am going to say a few more things, and then I will address briefly the issue of the Israeli elections, which is still an unsettled issue. Fortunately, the round of fighting was not too long. Fortunately, there is a ceasefire and things are going back to normal. But the question is, what is normal? And what will this process repeat itself again and again? So there is no doubt that Hamas is not interested in negotiations. They're not interested in a peace process with Israel. And that aspect is not sufficiently highlighted in the international coverage of the conflict. In the international coverage of the conflict, most of the emphasis is placed on the asymmetry in the number of victims on the Gazan side compared to the much smaller number of victims on the Israeli side, and the asymmetry in the extent of destruction on the Gaza side compared to the more limited destruction. There was destruction, but it was more limited on the Israeli side. But there is a great lack of analysis about who started the fighting, about the aggressive nature of Hamas and its very powerful arsenal of missiles and rockets, about the fact that there is Iranian involvement behind Hamas, and the fact that Israel has to act forcefully in order to deter future actions. And now we come to another complication, which could be a much more serious issue, Israel has to deter not only future actions by Hamas, but Israel has to deter future actions by Hezbollah from Lebanon. Hezbollah in Lebanon is an Islamic fundamentalist organization quite similar to Hamas, but there is a big difference. They are much more powerful. The size of their arsenal of rockets is much larger than Hamas, and it's also more sophisticated. So fortunately, in the round of fighting, Hezbollah was not involved, but there is great concern in Israel about any future possible conflict involving Hamas and Hezbollah at the same time, with a more active involvement on the part of Iran. These are concerns that are very serious in Israel. Okay, now I'm going to say one more word about the Israeli elections, because the situation is still frozen, it's still stuck, and I'll give a quick summary. So we have three columns: the pro-Bibi side, the anti-Bibi side. Bibi is Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, and the undecided. You know, the situation remains the same. The key player is Naftali Bennett from the Yamina party, which was supposed to join. The two undecided were one day before the eruption of the war with Hamas, were about to join the anti-Bibi camp, and they had enough votes to form a government. But then the war started, and Naftali Bennett, the head of Yamina, changed his mind, and he said, no, under these conditions, I am not willing to form an anti-Netanyahu government that is dependent on the support of two Arab parties. One is Ram and the other is the joint list. So that remains the situation today. So with Naftali Bennett still undecided, and it's not clear yet if he will join some kind of coalition with Netanyahu, which is unlikely because they don't have enough votes, or go back and join the anti-Netanyahu group. Okay, so I'm going to stop here in order to give you time for questions. Let me stop my share, and I welcome any questions for me or for Denise.
I just want to punctuate one point that you made that's like really important, because one of the allegations launched against Israel right now in the press is that Israel is an apartheid state. Now, the Ram party, I mean, this is the politics of it. The Ram party was part of the original joint list, which was all the Arab parties combined. And it split off recently because Mansour Abbas, who leads it, became more of a realist. And he decided, you know what, I'd rather worry about the infrastructure and the daily life of the Israeli Arabs within Israel, and he would rather be part of the government. And they were about to form a government for the first time with an Arab party. That Mansour Abbas has literally become the kingmaker in this political process in Israel. Now, if that's an apartheid state, I don't know, literally the power player right now is an Arab party. And most people don't know that. It's a little subtlety. And when the war broke out, it was also Mansour Abbas who said, right now, under these circumstances, right along with Naftali Bennett, he said, right now, I can't possibly sit down and form a government. So the whole thing fell apart as a result of this last round of violence. Any questions?
If you have a question, please unmute yourself, and you can ask it to either Hugo or Denise. After you've asked your question, please put yourself back on mute so we don't have any background noise.
I have a question. This is Shraga Eliav calling from Seattle. Thank you, Hugo, for inviting me. You did mention that if you can expand about the popularity or lack of popularity of Hamas by the Gaza residents. Are they tired of Hamas?
Okay, so actually, Hamas is not very popular in Gaza, but the people in Gaza don't have too much of a choice. They cannot speak up against Hamas. The big issue now, the big concern is Hamas's popularity in the West Bank, because the people in the West Bank have been stuck with the quote moderate regime of Mahmoud Abbas. By the way, don't get confused between Mahmoud Abbas, which is the leader of the West Bank, with Mansour Abbas, which is the leader of the small Arab party in Israel. Okay, so the people in the West Bank are not happy at all with the way things are going on the West Bank, because there is corruption and there is mismanagement, and they have not seen any result for the moderate approach to relations with Israel, because any peace process is now stuck. There is no peace process going on between the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority and Israel. So the fact that Hamas was willing to engage Israel militarily in a daring way, if you ask my opinion, in a crazily irresponsible way, irresponsible from every possible point of view, especially from the point of view of the population of Gaza. But Hamas decided to go for it to score political points in the West Bank. So the popularity of Hamas in the West Bank now is skyrocketing, because they were fighting for Jerusalem. They were fighting to liberate Al-Aqsa. Okay, so finally a Palestinian leader is doing something. So this is a very crazy logic that is going on now. Now, what I didn't have a chance to mention is that there were supposed to be elections in the West Bank that Mahmoud Abbas canceled just a few days before all of this happened. And in those elections, why did he cancel them? Because Hamas was positioned to do very well in those elections. So, so one of the motivations for Hamas to launch this military adventurism was to score political points, given that the elections were canceled. So you thought that Israeli politics were crazy and convoluted. Palestinian politics are also crazy and convoluted, with the difference that unfortunately people are dying as a result.
Thank you.
More questions?
I've got a question. First, Denise, I want to say my family was in Israel during 2014, and we had to deal with this raid. So I'm so sorry what you guys had to go through. It's horrible. My question is also for Hugo. Thank you both all for your wonderful presentations. And Biden is talking about trying to rebuild Gaza with rearming Hamas. He's got a pretty real thinker in Blinken. Is this possible? What do you do now with Gaza?
Okay. First of all, let me say a few words about the Biden administration and its approach to Israel. So on one hand, the Biden administration is behaving in a much more pro-Israeli way than it was previously anticipated, certainly before the elections in the US. Remember, there were great concerns that unlike the Trump administration, the Biden administration was not going to be a solid supporter of Israel. Now, the Biden administration is, in my reading, a solid supporter of Israel, but not, I think that the Biden administration is going to draw a line and not be a solid supporter of anything that, say, a Netanyahu administration will want to do in Israel. So it's going to be a less lenient supporter of Israel than the Trump administration was. However, in this case, Biden stood up in favor of Israel, and now things need to get going. So what do you do? So it's the same every time there is a conflict with Gaza. The poor people of Gaza are suffering tremendously. The infrastructure there has been a lot of destruction. And once again, there is a need to, please mute your mics. Once again, there is a need to rebuild a lot of the infrastructure. Now, how do you do it? Because whenever you channel resources to Gaza, either financial resources or materials for reconstruction, the Hamas administration has diverted those resources for military applications in order to rebuild the tunnels. So it's not clear to me how they're going to do it. In the statement made by Biden, he said that they're going to channel the aid through the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, basically through Fatah. Now, Fatah and Hamas are enemies. So how are they going to do that? Maybe there will be some kind of negotiation in order to channel some aid with some controls in terms of where does the money go and where does the cement and building materials go, because that has always been a problem in the past. There's also a role to be played by the Gulf countries. Qatar is a major intermediary between Israel and Hamas, and there is a chance that the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia also will get involved together with Egypt in some kind of intermediation. I think that it's a good thing to have some kind of intermediation, since Israel is not talking directly to Hamas to impose some conditions.
If I can just add a little something in there on what is being discussed within Israel among Israelis, because this is foreign policy from the United States, but within Israel on the ground, there's also a lot of, to your point, Hugo, at some point the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And there's a little bit more of an out-of-box thinking. There has always been some people that felt strongly that allowing the Gazan people to start to develop infrastructure and allow them to develop the means of actually providing services for the citizens is the way to go, because then they have a lot more to lose. Right now, life in Gaza, both from the Hamas perspective and even people on the ground, they virtually have nothing to lose. They have no infrastructure, they have no port, they have no power plant. And there's a lot of talk now within Israel of allowing them to actually have a port and have a power plant, because once that infrastructure is there, perhaps they'd be more reluctant to be reckless, to your point, Hugo, and wage war indiscriminately just as a power play, to score power points against Abbas in the West Bank. And I'm really glad you articulated that point, because I think a lot of people miss the nuance of what were the real motivations that Hamas had. And it isn't what the press is reporting. It really was a lot more politics within the Palestinian world than it was really Israel against, against Hamas. So I'm glad you articulate. And then there's one other point I want to make, and I can't punctuate this enough for Israelis on the ground. What made this, there were two things that made this action, that latest skirmish, more frightening than before. One, it wasn't dozens of missiles coming in every salvo now. Hamas has a lot more rockets, and they've come to understand that the best way to work around Iron Dome is to bombard it. So there were hundreds coming in at a time. So where in 2014, you might have heard 1, 2, 3 explosions overhead, and it was over within seconds. Now it was dozens, and it was going on for 20, 30 minutes at a time, with 160 rockets coming into Tel Aviv in one salvo. Also, a lot of people don't know that Iron Dome does not explode every missile that comes in. Every Iron Dome missile costs about $50,000 each. The way that the system operates, the minute a rocket is launched, it immediately knows the trajectory, and it'll only take out ones that are going to probably hit civilian targets. So and even with that, you can literally hear 20, 30, 40 explosions over your head. That meant those were things that were going to probably hit people or buildings, and not just falling in empty fields. That was one. The other thing that made this one fundamentally different was the feeling of a fifth column from within. The violence that was going on between Jews and Arabs within Israel proper in the mixed neighborhoods. And while that happened, Hugo pointed out very much so that the residents themselves were the ones that band together and said, oh, no, no. The protests against the violence was coming from joint movements and joint actions between Muslims and Jews banding together. There were several incidents where there were almost lynches. And if it was an almost lynch of a Jewish person, it was a Muslim that saved him and vice versa. And there were many stories of that. So, you know, on the one hand, it was kind of jarring to see this violence within that we hadn't seen since 1929, really. And then, but on the other hand, the hopeful piece of it was the way the citizens in these mixed communities were kind of uniting and saying, no, we don't want this kind of violence here. So it was a bit of a mixed bag, kind of jarring on the one hand, but also full of a lot of hope on the other. And I'm just giving you what I Israelis on the ground.
I want to add a couple of comments to what you just said. First of all, regarding the last point, the majority of the Arab citizens of Israel are really not interested in any conflict with the Jewish citizens of Israel. That's not in their agenda. They are not interested. They have some complaints. They want improvements regarding municipal issues and regarding budgets, but they are not interested at all in any violence or indiscriminate attacks on Jews or even on physical infrastructure, like there have been some incidents of destroying traffic lights and things like that. This is the work of a small band of criminals. Okay, regarding the Iron Dome and the fact that the Hamas experimented with the strategy of throwing huge salvos of missiles at the same time in order to overwhelm the system, by and large, it didn't work, that strategy. It was the reason why more than usual, a few more rockets got through, but by and large, Israel was able to recalibrate Iron Dome to reduce the number of rockets that got through, even when 100 rockets were thrown at the same time. Now, I have to remind you about the things that did not happen in this war. There were attempts by Hamas to introduce new techniques, new approaches to attacking Israel. One was a submarine, a remote control submarine. I don't know exactly what size of a submarine it is, but Israel was aware that they are planning to use it. It's like a remote control, it's like a drone underwater in order to attack some Navy installations. Israel was able to destroy it before it was launched at sea. The other was attack drones. And those are attack drones provided by Iran that Israel was also able to neutralize. So there were attempts by Hamas to introduce new military approaches that fortunately were not successful, but we should add, this time they were not successful, to the extent that the conflict remains simmering. We don't know what will happen next time, and things could be much more serious next time, like I said before, especially if there is another loose cannon in the neighborhood, which is Hezbollah, with a master loose cannon in the area, which is Iran. So there are serious preparations in Israel for possible contingencies in the future. But fortunately, things were kept under control this time around.
So before Rabbi Farber brings the evening to an end, I will have to take 30 seconds. Number one, to thank the Tamirs, not only for the commitments and the guidance, but the way they represented us on the media. You know, when you spoke with clarity, you spoke the pain of we Jews and the Israelis. You always have words also for the innocent Palestinian, which is what Jews do. So your story, it's absolutely amazing. When everybody knows, I know, that you are the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, that Ofer's mom lives in Israel. So you have the best of the Jewish identity, no? Your father rebuilt Jewish life and Jewish families instead of being a victim, and mom lives in Israel. It's a witness of reality. So thank you for your commitment, your clarity, And to Hugo, you're a genius. You know, this is the third time we have you with us, and you commit yourself and your wisdom. And to all of us, we have 68 screens, which means more than 100 people took the time to listen to the two of you, because Israel matters to us, because Beit Torah is in unwavering loyalty to the state of Israel. When other rabbis and communities have some doubts, we have no doubt about that being anti-Semite means to be an anti-Zionist and vice versa. And thank you to both of you. And now my teacher will close with his remarks. And thank you, Matt, for making the program possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Rossin, for thanking all the people we need to thank. Fantastic. And Matt and his whole staff and Marla for putting it together. We learned and we felt, right? We learned really professional, great presentations. And of course, Hugo's and Denise's incredible knowledge, intimate knowledge of Israel and Israeli psychology. And we felt it was, we can feel what you went through there. And to see Mom with that strength, right? That guiding the family, it's an enormous, impressive and uplifting thing. So what do we do here in America? Okay, I think the biggest obligation, many of you, both of you pointed it out, there are significant lies that are emanating from both press and from significant politicians in Washington. And that is the lie that Israel has bombed without any care areas in Gaza that result in the death of civilians. That has to be confronted. As you pointed out, Denise, so beautifully, Israel does everything possible beyond what any army has ever done or would do in order to prevent the deaths of civilians. And many of the civilian deaths were also caused by errant rockets that were shot by the Palestinians themselves, by Hamas themselves. We have to confront that. The other thing that's extremely important is we've seen a move larger than we've ever seen before to actually try and block a sale of sophisticated weaponry to Israel and to prevent the rearming or resupply of the Iron Dome system. Now, those attempts are going to fail, but the fact that they even exist, the fact that there are numbers of people of any significance in Washington who would support that type of punishment to Israel for daring to defend herself, right, is something that we have to combat. And we have the power to do that by writing to our congressman, writing to our president, demonstrating, showing support for Israel, making it clear that Israel was the one that was attacked, and Israel is one that is doing its best to prevent civilian casualties. The irony is, of course, if the Iron Dome was unable to perform efficiently because it didn't have enough supply or because there were too many rockets being shot at the Iron Dome and it could not catch up, Israel would have no choice in order to protect her children, her women, her men, her Holocaust survivors, her civilians would have no choice but to attack Gaza with such strength and also invade that the death toll would be far greater in Gaza and sadly also amongst Israeli soldiers and civilians. So those who supposedly are peaceniks and so worried about civilian casualties are actually pushing an agenda that would cause a much more significant war and much greater death and destruction. So this is the things that we have to put out there, talk to people about who don't understand, realize there's tremendous goodwill towards Israel in this country. They just sometimes don't have the facts in order to understand what's really going on there. We have to make sure that American support militarily, financially for Israel is extremely strong. A strong Israel is what will prevent a much more dangerous and deadly war. And the final thing is, all of this has to do with one thing and one thing only. It's the four-letter word, Iran. None of this happens without Iran. And you pointed out very well, and so did you, Denise. The weaponry, the money, the political cover, all comes from Iran. They are the instigators. They are the ones who bankroll it. They're the ones who try and gain politically from this. And of course, they're also religious fanatics. Let's not forget that they do have a religious component to it. So we have to keep aware that Iran is the main issue and the problem, and make sure that Iran is not enriched again unless there is a way to make sure that a commitment is forthcoming and enforced, that she will cease her support of terror, not just in Israel, but throughout the entire Middle East. And one other thing, I didn't know if I heard it, The other thing they wanted to destroy Hamas was the Abraham Accords, because the Abraham Accords, along with an Arab party almost entering into an Israeli government as equals with power in that government to seek things for their community, like we all do when we're in government. We try and build our own community. Abraham Accords and an Arab party in the Israeli government is something Hamas cannot tolerate, because it shows that the vast majority of the Arab world is moving towards peace with Israel, coexistence with Israel, building each other's countries for the betterment of the civilians that live there, their citizens, and that is something Hamas is trying to kill. And we have to try and prevent Hamas from accomplishing those goals. I hope and pray that the new government does form, and that the Arab party is included, and that the Abraham Accords continue to expand. That will sideline Hamas and eventually overwhelm Iran as well.
Man.
So thank you both. Wow, we felt
Kol hakavod.
wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Kol hakavod.
Matt, you're in charge, I think. Matt has